Module 12, the cerebral cortex. So today we're going to talk about the various regions of the cerebral cortex, describe their functions, and if we hustle, we'll be discussing the brain's ability to reorganize itself and talk about brain plasticity. What are the functions of the various cerebral cortex regions? Older brain networks sustain basic life functions and enable memory, emotions, and basic drives. Newer neural networks within the cerebrum, the hemispheres that contribute about 85% of the brain's weight, form specialized work teams that enable our perceiving, our thinking, and speaking. Like other structures above the brainstem, including the thalamus, the hippocampus, and the amygdala, the cerebral hemispheres come as a pair. Covering those hemispheres like a bark on a tree is the cerebral cortex, a thin surface layer of interconnected neural cells. It is your brain's thinking crown, your body's ultimate control and information processing center. As we move up the ladder of animal life, the cerebral cortex expands, tight genetic controls relax, and the organism's adaptability increases. Frogs and other small cortex amphibians operate extensively on pre-programmed genetic instructions. The larger cortex of mammals offers increased capacities for learning and for thinking, enabling them to be more adaptable. What makes us distinctively human mostly arises from the complex functions of our cerebral cortex. Just in case you want a definition and want me to slow down a little bit, the intricate fabric of the interconnected neural cells covering the cerebral hemispheres, the body's ultimate control and information processing center. The structure of the cortex. If you opened a human skull, exposing the brain, you would see a wrinkled organ shaped somewhat like the meat of an oversized walnut. Without the wrinkles, a flattened cerebral cortex would require about triple the area, roughly that of a large pizza. The brain's left and right hemispheres are filled mainly with axons connecting the cortex to the brain's other regions. The cerebral cortex, that thin surface layer, contains some 20 to 23 billion nerve cells and 300 trillion synaptic connections. Being human takes a lot of nerve. Supporting these billions of nerve cells are 9 times as many spidery glial cells, or glue cells. Neurons are like queen bees. On their own, they cannot feed or sheathe themselves, but glial cells are like worker bees. They provide nutrients and insulating myelin, guide neural connections, and they mop up ions and neurotransmitters. Glia may also play a role in learning and thinking. By chatting with neurons, they might participate in information transmission and even memory. In more complex animal brains, the proportion of glia to neurons increases. A post-mortem analysis of Einstein's brain did not find more or larger than usual neurons, but it did reveal a much greater concentration of glial cells than found in the average head. Each hemisphere's cortex is subdivided into 4 lobes, separated by prominent fissures or folds. Starting at the front of your brain and moving over the top, there are the frontal lobes, which are right behind your forehead. The parietal lobes at the top of the rear. The occipital lobes at the back of your head. Reversing direction and moving forward, just above your ears, you find the temporal lobes. Each of the 4 lobes carries out many functions, and many functions require the interplay of those lobes. Functions of the cortex. More than a century ago, surgeons found damaged cortical areas during autopsies of people who had been partially paralyzed or speechless. This rather crude evidence did not prove that specific parts of the cortex control complex functions like movement or speech. After all, if the entire cortex controlled speech and movement, damage to almost any area might produce the same effect. A TV with its power cord cut would go dead, but we would be fooling ourselves if we thought we had localized the picture in the cord. Scientists had better luck in localizing simpler brain functions. For example, in 1870, German physicians Gustav Fritzsch and Eduard Hitzig made an important discovery. Mild electrical stimulation to parts of an animal's cortex made part of its body move. The effects were selective. Stimulation caused movement only when applied to the arc-shaped region at the back of the frontal lobe, running roughly from ear to ear across the top of the brain. Moreover, stimulating parts of this region in the left or right hemisphere caused movements of specific body parts on the opposite side of the body. So Fritz and Hitzig had discovered what is now called the motor cortex. Mapping the motor cortex. Lucky for the brain surgeons and their patients, the brain has no sensory receptors. Knowing this, Oughtred, Forster, and Wilder Penfried were able to map the motor cortex in hundreds of wide-awake patients by stimulating different cortical areas and observing the body's responses. They discovered the body areas requiring precise control, such as the fingers and the mouth, occupy the greatest amount of cortical space. In one of his many demonstrations of motor behavioral mechanics, Spanish neuroscience, Jose Delgado stimulated a spot on the patient's left motor cortex, triggering the right hand to make a fist. Asked to keep the fingers open during the next stimulation, the patient whose fingers closed despite his best efforts remarked, "I guess, doctor, that your electricity is stronger than my will." More recently, scientists were able to predict a monkey's arm motion a tenth of a second before it moved by repeatedly measuring motor cortex activity preceding specific arm movements. Such findings have opened the door to research on brain-controlled computers. Brain-computer interfaces. By eavesdropping on the brain, could we enable someone, perhaps a paralyzed person, to move a robotic limb? Could a brain-computer interface command a cursor to write an email or search the internet? To find out, Brown University brain researchers implanted 100 tiny, recording little electrodes in the motor cortexes of 3 monkeys. As the monkey used a joystick to move a cursor to follow a moving red target to gain rewards, the researchers matched the brain signals with the arm movements. Then they programmed a computer to monitor the signals and operate the joystick. When a monkey merely thought about a move, the mind-reading computer moved the cursor with nearly the same proficiency as had the reward-seeking monkey. In follow-up experiments, 2 monkeys were trained to control a robot arm that could grasp and deliver food, and then a human did the same. Clinical trials of such cognitive neural prosthetics are now underway with people who have suffered paralysis or amputation. The first patient, a paralyzed 25-year-old man, was able to mentally control a TV, draw shapes on a computer screen, play video games, all thanks to an aspirin-sized chip with 100 microelectrodes recording activity in his motor cortex. If everything psychological is also biological, if, for example, every thought is also a neural event, then microelectrodes perhaps could detect thoughts well enough to enable people to control events. Sensory functions. If the motor cortex sends messages out to the body, where does the cortex receive the incoming messages? Wilder Penfield also identified the cortical area that specializes in receiving information from the skin senses and from the movement of body parts. This area, at the front of the parietal lobes, parallel to and just behind the motor cortex, we now call the somatosensory cortex. Stimulate a point on top of this band of tissue, and a person may report being touched on the shoulder. Stimulate some point on the side, and the person might feel something on the face. The more sensitive the body region, the larger the somatosensory cortex area devoted to it. Your supersensitive lips project to a larger brain area than do your toes, which is one of the reasons we kiss with our lips rather than touch toes. Rats have a large area of brain devoted to their whisker sensations, and owls to their hearing. Scientists have identified additional areas where the cortex receives input from senses other than touch. At this moment, you're receiving visual information in the visual cortex in your occipital lobes at the very back of your brain. A bad enough bash there would make you blind. Stimulated there, you might see flashes of light or dashes of color. In a sense, we do have eyes in the back of our head. From your occipital lobes, visual information goes to other areas that specialize in tasks such as identifying words, detecting emotion, recognizing faces. Any sound you now hear is being processed by your auditory cortex in your temporal lobes, which is just above your ears. Most of the auditory information travels a circuitous route from one ear to the auditory receiving area above your opposite ear. If stimulated there, you might hear a sound. MRI scans of people with schizophrenia reveal active auditory areas in the temporal lobes during auditory hallucinations. Even the phantom ringing sound experienced by people with hearing loss is, if heard in one ear, associated with the activity in the temporal lobe on the brain's opposite side. Association areas. So far, we've pointed out small cortical areas that either receive sensory input or direct muscular output. Together, they occupy about 1/4 of the human brain's thin, wrinkled cover. What then goes on in the vast regions of the cortex? In these association areas, neurons are busy with higher mental functions, many of the tasks that make us human. Electrically probing an association area won't trigger any observable response. So unlike the sensory and motor areas, association areas' function cannot be neatly mapped. Their silence has led to what Dr. McBurney has called one of the hardiest weeds in the garden of psychology. The claim that we ordinarily use only 10% of our brains. If true, wouldn't this imply about 90% chance that a bullet to your brain would land in an unused area? Surgically lesioned animals and brain-damaged humans bear witness that association areas are not dormant. Rather, these areas interpret, integrate, and act on sensory information and link it with stored memories, which is a very important part of thinking. Association areas are found in all 4 lobes. The prefrontal cortex in the forward part of the frontal lobes enables judgment, planning, processing of new memories. People with damaged frontal lobes may have intact memories, high scores on intelligence tests, and great cake baking skills, yet they would not be able to plan ahead to begin baking a cake for a birthday party. Frontal lobe damage can also alter personality and remove a person's inhibitions. You've already heard the classic case of Phineas Gage. One afternoon in 1848, Gage, then 25, was packing gunpowder into a rock with a tamping iron, and the gunpowder ignited, shooting the rod up through his left cheek and out the top of his skull, leaving his frontal lobes massively damaged. To everyone's amazement, he was immediately able to sit up and speak, and after the wound healed, he returned to work, but the soft-spoken man was now irritable, profane, and dishonest. This person, said his friends, was no longer Gage. Although his mental abilities and memories were intact, his personality was certainly not. More recent studies of people with damaged frontal lobes have revealed similar impairments. Not only may they become less inhibited without the frontal lobe brakes on their impulses, but their moral judgments may seem unrestrained by normal emotions. Would you advocate pushing someone in front of a runaway boxcar to save 5 others? Most people do not, but with damage to the brain area behind the eyes, often they say they might. With the frontal lobes ruptured, people's moral compass seems to disconnect from their behavior.